Hi, everybody. This is Leslie Bonci, and I am here with my colleague, Roberta Anding. We are both registered dietitian, board certified specialists in sports dietetics, and also the co-founders of Performance 365, a performance nutrition consulting company based in the United States. So we are bringing a lot of experience, and that means a lot of experience, hashtag fossil fuel. This is what this is about, as well as the excellence and the competence in working with active individuals. And what we hope to do in these conversations is to really translate the scientific recommendations into practical applications, because that's really where it is at the end of the day. And the topic that we have today is talking about digestive issues in athletes. And let me just say, if your gut doesn't feel good, you do not feel good. This can reduce big men to tears. This is definitely performance detracting in every single way. So we really want to address some of the issues of what's there, as well as talk about solutions. So I'm going to start off with a question to Roberta. And that question is, Roberta, how does exercise affect the GI tract?
It affects it in two main domains. One is the physical, is that as you start to exercise and you're moving your muscles, you're diverting blood flow to your arms and legs to make sure that you've got enough oxygen, enough nutrition to those exercising muscles. So since we all have a finite amount of blood, right? We just can't go out and manufacture more blood. Then what that means is we're diverting blood flow from the gut to the extremities to make sure that the oxygen and nutrition needs are met. So that's one. Two, it's the psychological piece of exercise. And so when we think about us as humans, we're not only the physical being, but we're the psychological being. And so this is where athletes oftentimes will say, exercise and my gut don't get along very well. And they have a belief that if they eat X food, they're going to get sick. So a basic tenet of digestive health in athletes is it's not good nutrition if it ends up on your shoes. Regardless of how well it's planned, we have to take into account that exercise does impact physical and psychological approaches to physical activity.
And I know that you've seen this as well as I, is there's so many athletes, both male, female, all different types of sports, that say, I cannot eat anything before exercise. And then the second part of that sentence is, I don't know why I'm so exhausted when I'm exercising.
Yeah.
This is not a surprise, but that's not an acceptable answer. And we need to take that information and then fine tune and tailor and customize to help our athletes create a plan that is actually doable.
Yep. So when we think about this, the companion question to that is stress and activity. How do those two things interplay? And we've all had times in our life that have been very stressful. You're anxious about an exam, you're anxious about an interview or a promotion, and all of a sudden your gut starts talking to you. Well, the stress hormones do impact how your gut empties. And so if food hangs around in your stomach for a longer period of time, it can absolutely cause nausea. It can make you feel sick to your stomach. And I had an athlete one time that he could not tolerate his pregame meal, which was 9 a.m. for a noon kickoff. And so we backed it up to 6 o'clock in the morning, still got sick. Woke him up at 3 o'clock in the morning, still got sick. So that wasn't the food that was being served, nor was it the form, and which I'll mention just in a minute. It wasn't either one of those. It was him being really nervous that this was the first time in his life he hadn't started. And so he was really anxious about this. And so now all of a sudden you have athletes who will go and do other things. Like, okay, maybe I need to fast beforehand. Maybe I shouldn't even have water. So you can see how things go off track. So I do think sometimes when someone is really stressed, changing the form of the food from a solid to a liquid, because I think as nutrition professionals, we all know liquids tend to leave the stomach faster than solid food, that we may need to change the form so we can change the function.
And the other
what kind of add-on
around the stress issue is that as we have our expertise in sports dietetics, but We are not therapists. It's not
Right.
what we do. And when you're working with an athlete who has a great deal of stress, how can you really be of greatest benefit to that athlete, aside from what it is that you might make in terms of nutrition recommendations, is perhaps it's a referral so that
Right.
that athlete can get the help that he or she needs to be able to manage their stress appropriately, which means that then they're going to be able to actually implement the recommendations that we make. So everybody looks good. It's a win-win situation all the way around.
And clearly a team approach, right? Clearly a team approach that might not be the right person to help them to deal with the stress, but can recognize it and make the appropriate referral. So Leslie, in your experience, are there foods or fad diets or supplements that really impact that digestive health from a real physical parameter, not so much psychological, but physically? What does your experience tell you?
And I would say absolutely number one, it is hydration. So whether it is lack thereof, so subhydration or overhydration, either way, you're destined for a gastrointestinal disaster. It's going to happen because if the gut is not optimally hydrated, you have the hitting a standstill. You have all of these potential issues of, it could be bloating, it could be sluggish bowels. It certainly has an impact on energy all the way around. And you don't address that right before competition. Ooh, now it's time to hydrate. What are you doing in the time leading up to that? So that is absolutely number one. Second, and Roberta, as you mentioned, I'll say it again, it is volume. Well, I'm a big guy, therefore I need a lot. Not right before your body is physically active. Sometimes the postage stamp is really what we talk about. And I will tell you personally, when I talk to my athletes around the time of exercise, I will say pre-exercise snack rather than pre-exercise meal. And the reason for that is because typically when we think about that, all right, a snack typically connotes a smaller amount of food than does a meal. So that might feel more comfortable in the gut. And, that also goes on the back end. If somebody is exercised intensely, they're exhausted, they just don't feel good, they don't feel hungry, that is not the time to be shoveling in food. It's a little bit, and then you recover as you feel more comfortable. Third thing, and Roberta, you mentioned this, and I will reiterate, it is the form. And that's why I'm a really big believer in training the gut. This is not just training the other muscles of the body, not just the heart, the lungs, the legs, and the arm. It is the gut, so that you find what that tolerance is. And oftentimes things that are liquid or semi-solid, because yes, there is that perception that they're leaving the stomach more quickly. So some people might be fine with a bar. Others are like, that feels like a brick in my gut. I need something in a jello form that's going to leave the building a little bit faster, so to speak. Some of the things as well that could be irritants, excess caffeine. Think about all of the energy drinks that are out there. Caffeine in and of itself, for some individuals, that is a GI irritant, let alone the fact that it may indeed cause loose bowels in some individuals. Sugar alcohols is another one. And it's not that people are necessarily, oh, let's sit down to a big bowl of erythritol. That's not happening. But depending upon the bars, the shake, the powder, whatever they choose, and especially those that tend to be advertised as low carb, they may have some sweeteners in them that may precipitate GI issues. Fiber, another one, and we all know how important that is, and we talk about that all the time, but you really have to be planned with it. And maybe a bowl of bran cereal before a competition might not be the right thing to do because it's just a little bit too stressful to the gut at that point in time. And I think low carb diets as a trend that really is not necessarily comfortable for the digestive tract. Now, that's not to say that some people might have sensitivity to particular carbohydrates. And even then, not everybody does. This is more trendy than it is the actuality of what goes on. But when you don't have those foods that promote GI motility, then indeed you might be creating a problem down the road. And that's what we're trying to prevent. It is being preventative and proactive and purposeful and positive in the recommendations that we make so that we don't have any unintended consequences.
And I'll add on to that. I think the positive piece of this is really very important, that we can solve, as registered dietitians, nutritionists, we can solve the GI issues. It might take a little bit of playing around and seeing what form, how far away from competition does this need to be. But if the fear is, I can't eat anything, then you start to see people gravitate towards dietary approaches, such as gluten-free and low FODMAPs. And so Leslie, in your experience, do you take people to a low FODMAP diet? And first of all, would you define it and then give us your wisdom on whether or not you would recommend something like this?
So when we talk about FODMAPs, what we are talking about is particular classes of carbohydrates that pass through the gut undigested, and then they ferment in the lower colon. And those will include lactose. They will include the fructans, which we find in wheat. They will include the oligosaccharides that are in beans and some other fruits and vegetables. They also include the polyols, which are the sugar alcohol. Now, the thing about that is when you look at that list, it's like, wow, that's a lot of food. And one of the big concerns is always with an athlete is you can't create an energy deficit. That's really not what we want to do. And so even though there are some people that benefit from low FODMAP, particularly individuals who already have a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome, not every athlete has IBS. They don't. It may be the exercise itself that triggers some of the symptoms that we have. So we want to be very, very targeted in this approach of what we do. And in some of the studies that have looked at this, of the two biggest culprits, and I'm using that word very, very carefully here, in athletes, it may indeed be those foods that contain lactose and those foods that are high in fructose. That being said, does that mean we want athletes to never again consume dairy or fruit? Absolutely not. We're thinking about what happens around the time of exercise and seeing if making some changes may indeed help to get some symptom relief so that we have athletes that are in less digestive distress.
So it sounds like oftentimes athletes will say, I felt better when I was gluten-free. And so staying away from wheat may actually be part of that low FODMAP diet. Is that correct?
Well, and because when we think about gluten, right, in the categories, wheat, rye, barley, and oats, and the wheat is highest in fructans. So it may not be the need to be gluten-free. It may be I'm not doing wheat. But again, if not, all right, I will not have any carbohydrate on my plate. That's what we don't want to do. We still want to find some appropriate substitutes. And the other thing I would say about kind of this idea of how do you use FODMAP appropriately with athletes is you really try and hone in on the time surrounding exercise, what's happening before, during, and after. So it's kind of a very, very select targeted FODMAP approach that may not have to be for the entire day, is really thinking more around what kind of changes we can make when we are asking that gut to move, as will happen when we're physically active. So Roberta, that being said, is what are some of the concerns about using a low FODMAP approach with athletes?
I think one of the concerns, and I think you did a great job of highlighting it, is when are you going to use it? Are you going to try this around physical activity? Because I think, as we all know, the more restricted or constricted your dietary choices are, the more likely you are to end up with malnutrition, right? Or you're ending up with a nutrient deficit. And so, as you mentioned, lactose, we can all think of, if I get rid of dairy, if I eliminate dairy, I'm going to be decreasing my protein intake. I'm going to be decreasing my calcium intake in a biologically available form. And certainly you can go to plant-based milks, but the calcium is oftentimes added. And when it's added, it precipitates out. And so it sinks to the bottom. So if you're using a plant-based milk, you really have to shake it. So I think what ends up happening on low FODMAP diets that are not planned with a registered dietitian nutritionist, that are planned on their own or downloaded from the internet, the food becomes constricted. We end up with malnutrition or malnutrition of certain targeted nutrients that we know are really very important for athletes. And then you see people believing that carbohydrates are all bad. And so their approach is, well, I guess I'll just go paleo, or I guess I'll just go keto because all carbs are going to have these FODMAP things. And so now I'm going to restrict it. So again, I think the downside for us nutrition professionals is nutrient deficits. I think the downside psychologically is there's something wrong with my body. And so I must go on a restrictive meal plan. And again, I see this a lot in the part of the world I live in is really hot. And I see a lot of people have GI distress related to the heat. They go on a low FODMAP diet. And then all of a sudden I'm seeing them for other issues, bone health related issues, because they've restricted their intake. So what is your experience? Do you see something similar, Leslie?
Absolutely. But I would add to that as well is that because it's about the restrictions, some of the replacements are actually higher in cost. You know, when you think about gluten-free products that are out there, right? And a loaf of gluten-free bread is not inexpensive. If you don't like it, that means you're going to throw it. You have to freeze it. Otherwise, it gets moldy quickly. So, you know, we have to factor that in as well. And I also think, and I say this to my athletes all the time, it's like, you know, are you doing this because you really think you need to, or because another athlete that you admire, therefore you will do it too? And even when we look at gluten in particular, how about gluten less, not gluten free? So maybe you're not eating a trough of pasta. Maybe you're going to try a smaller amount, and, you know, or not having a bagel the size of an SUV tire. Okay, I had something that was smaller, and you may feel more comfortable simply because you're changing the volume. So it really is a trial and error. And, you know, I think I always like the idea of being as inclusive as we possibly can, instead of no, 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 because it's very, very difficult to make that up when you have somebody who needs those calories each and every day.
And I really appreciate your thoughts on the cost, because when we look at athletes who have really high calorie needs, 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day, it gets really expensive. And if you're funding it on your own, or even if you have a partial scholarship from your university, it also becomes really expensive, because where am I going to go eat with my friends? So it can be socially isolating. I think there's a lot of factors that we need to consider when people are jumping to either a gluten-free diet or a low FODMAP diet. Is, can they afford it? Is it the right thing for them to do? And as you said, do they just need a little bit less of this food versus the massive portions? Could, instead of you having pasta, could you make a dish with rice instead, to make sure that you're containing cost, versus saying, I'm going to have pasta, so I guess I've got to go buy gluten-free pasta. And so that's my only alternative, rather than saying there are naturally gluten-free foods that are carbohydrates that we can capitalize, that are not high in FODMAPs as well. Absolutely. So how do we create a gut-friendly diet for athletes? How do we do that?
I think first and foremost is definitely trying to optimize the hydration. And we know that that is not one size fits all, and that requires practice and prioritizing fluid. And again, reiterating to our athletes is it's not just what's in your bottle or your glass, but other foods that are part of your hydration. And that is fruits and vegetables. And that could be a soup or a stew or an oatmeal, liquidy cereals, or a shake. All of those things work towards optimizing fluid over the course of the day. The second is volume. And again, around that time of exercise, thinking more about snack size versus meal size. And when you actually sit down to eat, when your body is not physically active, that is where you can eat a little bit more, because you're not going to be moving quite as quickly. You know, another thing, and I mentioned this, I'll say it again, the idea of training the gut is you want to practice with those foods what it is you have before, certainly what you do during. For long duration activity, what feels comfortable for one gut may not feel comfortable for yours. Some people like things that tend to have a more savory taste over a sweet taste, and realizing that there's a lot of products out there that are similar. So for instance, the goos, the gels, the chomps, the chews, the sports drinks, you can't really do like the little barista, hey, a little this, a little that, all those things together, because your gut is not going to be happy. So, you know, we don't want to have so much variety during a period of activity that, again, it ends up out of us rather than in us, because then it's not doing the body any good whatsoever. Certainly around the time of exercise, this is not a recommendation of no fiber. It's a recommendation of being very careful with how much fiber you're having around the time of physical activity, so that you don't have any gut distress, or that you feel like you're running to the potty and not necessarily running on the field, because it's just distracting all the way around. And really also taking a look at supplements, because there are some supplements that really can be digestive distressing. Some people even find creatine to be digestive distressing to them. More is not better. More may actually create problems, and you try them out far away from any type of a competitive event so that you can ascertain whether or not those foods are going to be comfortable. Practice is the best way to establish a healthy relationship so that you can be part of the good gut club. That's what we want to see.
And I will add a little bit more on hydration is that every athlete I've ever worked with thinks they're hydrated because they drink or they carry their gallon jug around with them. And I'll say, how much weight did you lose in practice? Well, I don't know. What's the color of your urine? Well, I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. So there are assessment techniques that you can employ to help your athletes recognize that on Wednesday before their big game over the weekend, that's the time to really start to correct this and make sure that you have a dilute urine and that you're not losing a lot of weight during practice. I also think that we also need to encourage our athletes that when we're looking at some of these liquid forms or easily digested forms, oftentimes they are in the form of sugar. And I call this sugar with a purpose. This is not going out and eating lots and lots of candy 7 days a week, but it's strategically looking at easily digested carbohydrates that during that physical activity may contain sugar. And then we're just saying, yes, this is sugar with a purpose. It's going to fuel your muscles. And this is what you need at that time. And to your point about supplements, I have seen a lot of athletes who decide it's a really good idea to take a calcium magnesium product. And if the form is magnesium oxide, that's what's in milk and magnesia. So now your gut distress is related to a supplement that you took, but you didn't connect the two. So I think that kind of supplement survey of what are you taking, did you practice it, to your point, are all really important considerations. So we are very grateful that we had the opportunity to look at digestive health issues with you. And for more information on digestive health and low FODMAP diets, please go to nutrium.com and check out the blog posts. And thank you.
Thank you.